Hello, welcome to Polyfile. I'm Jeff. Today we're going to start with sort of the obvious question that needs to be answered first. What is polyamory anyway? What are we talking about here? Now, getting into what this actually means requires that we kind of define some things, and because this channel is based around trying to come up with very effective and precise communication and definition of terms, I'm going to have to define some of these things in more strict ways than people might be used to, but I think it'll become clear why that's important. This is not meant to be elitist or anything, it's mainly just trying to be precise. So, polyamory is the practice, desire, or acceptance of having more than one partner at a time with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved. Now, one of the kind of obvious points here that's a little bit weird is the use of the term partner. Well, what is a partner? Is that someone who you are having sex with, someone who you live with, someone who you trust, someone who you love? Where are we going with this? There's lots of different places to take this, and I think this is the point that causes a lot of contention. So what are some different ways we view the idea of partnership? What is a partner? Well, often to a lot of people it's some sense of a romantic connection. Now this on its own is something that's fairly vaguely defined, but it's fairly different from the other ways that some people look at it. One of the other ways that this is often defined, though, is in terms of sort of a bar of acceptable behavior that your culture defines for you. So there's things you can do with your partner you cannot do with others. Now, the common one that you see in a lot of cultures is you can't have sexual interaction with people who are not your partner. And that kind of explains what we see, but there's things outside of that as well, which we'll get to. In some cultures, it's you can't speak to someone of the opposite sex who is not your partner. So that kind of muddies this as well. In other cultures as well, you might not be able to show your hair to someone who is not your partner. Like this becomes very, very complicated when you start looking at it as being this bar of acceptable behavior, because it means that what one group says is monogamous, another group won't. And it's not because they feel or think differently about it, it's because the rules of their background are actually different. So we're trying to get away from that and try and come up with a generic way of defining the difference between these and being able to put different people kind of on different sides of a line to be able to have conversations about what they're doing and what their experiences are. So if we try and take a step back a bit to kind of contrast these ideas of how people define monogamy and partnership and all those things, in order to get closer to where we can talk more directly about polyamory, let's look at a different kind of grouping of relationship styles, something which we call non-monogamy. Now this is where things get confusing, because non-monogamy is usually defined actually in terms of sexual interactions, not romantic interactions or romantic feelings or bonding. Now this makes things really confusing when you start looking at what's otherwise monogamous relationships or pair bonds that then have non-monogamous behaviors, which they constrain in a certain way to maintain the stability of their relationship. And this is something that we need to talk about when looking at this entire umbrella of ideas. So let's look at non-monogamy as sort of a broad umbrella term. Well, first of all, underneath non-monogamy, what are we looking at? Because this is a broad area. There's lots of different things that are very disconnected or connected in different ways. Well, first of all, we have the distinction between ethical and non-ethical non-monogamy. Now, this is a fairly clear one. Ethical is ones where no one's breaking any rules, we'll say, and the unethical ones are areas such as infidelity or related ideas and terms thrown around there, where you're effectively cheating the rules of the relationship as defined by the members going into it. So looking more specifically at ethical non-monogamy, well, what are some of the different arrangements that people have within this? And where does polyamory fit in relative to all these other ways of looking at things? And how do we distinguish between them? Well, the first thing I'm going to talk about is there's a concept that a lot of people have heard of referred to as swinging. Now this is usually something done by otherwise monogamous couples. But, well, how could they do this if they're monogamous? Well, this is where we come into this issue of they'll define the relationship itself as being something of singular core importance based on a romantic bond. But outside of that, they permit sexual behaviors with other people, usually constrained in such a way that they have to do it together or only within certain contexts or times or places. And this is how they are allowed to sort of have their fun, but not change the way their relationship is actually structured. A related idea, which you sometimes see, which is very, very similar, but kind of a little bit more relaxed in terms of its structure and rules, is what a lot of people refer to as an open relationship. So here you have something which is at its core a monogamous relationship, usually. Usually it's monogamous when we use these terms. It doesn't have to be, though. And then they have other sort of external interactions with people where they're allowed to do different things. Usually these are sexual interactions which are normally reserved only for their actual partner, but because they've made an agreement that, yeah, we're not threatened by this, these people are then allowed to do things outside of the relationship. Now, this is not really any different from any other monogamous relationship when we look back at that cultural ideas and the distinctions between what some people are allowed to do and some people aren't. Remember, in some cultures, you're not allowed to talk to people who aren't your partner, who are of the opposite sex. In this situation, all we're doing is lowering the bar further and saying, yeah, you can have sex with them, but just remember, ours is the relationship. Now, this idea of the relationship is, I think, the real defining point between distinguishing what is monogamy and what is polyamory, trying to explain it in greater detail beyond just some fuzzy terms that we're throwing around to try and include or exclude various ideas and behaviors as we see fit. In this situation, if you have the relationship, the idea that there's one core monogamous bond between two people, which needs to be maintained as being the special relationship, nothing can mean as much as this. There cannot be a bond that is as important to either person as this. That is where you get monogamy. So where does polyamory work relative to this? Now that we've got this idea of the relationship, well, how does it play relative to that idea? Well, in polyamory, you typically don't have the relationship. Some people do, but I'm not sure that you'd really call that polyamory. Because it's actually a very monogamous structure and a very monogamous idea. Typically, what it means is that you'll say, yes, I have people that I care about. Some of them I'll call my partners, some are family, some are friends, some are colleagues, whatever. But those that are my partner, I'm not going to say, well, I can only have one of those. And I'm also not going to say they can only have one of those. No, I can have multiple friends, multiple colleagues, multiple family members, multiple partners. All right, so how do you navigate this complex kind of nebulous web of different kinds of relationships, and how do you manage this? How do you prioritize it? Well, generally speaking, you don't. Prioritization is not a relationship concept. Do you prioritize your friends? That's kind of, or your family members. Those things are kind of sick. So, no, prioritization of your time and your resources, that's a logistics thing. Now, that does come up, but that comes up in every kind of interaction with other people. It's not I defined a fixed order of how everyone gets my time and who I will help under what circumstances. No, you make sense of the world as it approaches you. Sometimes someone you've been with for many, many years may not be the person you have to rush out to help in the middle of the night. Maybe that's someone else, because maybe that's what they need. Maybe that's what you can do. Sometimes there's no fixed rules about how to interact with people. We all make it up as we go along. And we need to acknowledge that the freedom to do that is an important thing, and that's what defines much of polyamory. So now that I've sort of defined basically how it's worth looking at these things, well, okay, how do we actually split between these? Like, I've heard people say that poly and open are kind of the same thing, and I'm going to say they're not. And I'm going to use a very specific way of describing this. I don't think that poly and open are different things. I also don't think they're the same thing. I think they are orthogonal. Meaning, you can be both poly and open, or monogamous and open. Now this, of course, diverges from my earlier definition of open relationship, and that's kind of on purpose. What we usually refer to as an open relationship is an open monogamous relationship. Simply because monogamous is usually implicit in our culture. Not because we're changing the definition here, just because we're being more descriptive now. So you can see this come up sometimes, and it might actually surprise people who aren't used to the poly world that there is concept of closed poly. Now, usually when you run into what would be called a closed poly relationship, people don't call it that. Usually they'll refer to it as a closed triad or a closed quad, something like that, where they actually have sort of a small group of people that they closely trust, and they act like kind of a mainstream monogamous couple would. It's just there's not two of them. There's a bunch. And They have things that they run in whatever way makes sense for them, and there's just more than two of them. So this is why there's a real distinction, which is important to draw, between open relationships, closed relationships, polyamorous relationships, monogamous relationships. Normally when you try and explain yourself to someone in the poly world, because we've had too much of the every definition is right all the time approach, it's really hard to choose your words to actually communicate an idea. You usually need to use a lot more of them and spend a lot more time trying to explain the details of your circumstances before anyone understands the basics of how you approach other human beings. Now, of course, when you're actually going into a relationship with people like this, things are going to be much better defined anyway, and that's one of the key ideas. One of the things I just wanted to close on is a lot of people from kind of the outside looking in think polyamory is about, oh, crazy sex parties and all that, and being involved with lots of people and having sort of this crazy free love way of interacting. And the reality is quite different. If you actually talk to people who are in polyamorous relationships or have been in a lot of them in the past, if you ask them what it's all about, they'll tell you it's about communication. The thing that a lot of people are surprised to find out is people in polyamorous relationships talk a lot. And that's not code for anything. They literally need to express how they feel about everything, because they're going somewhere where there's no assumptions. There's no implicit rules. Now, those are wrong most of the time, even in monogamous relationships, but most people don't notice because all of the corner cases don't come up. Well, in polyamory, the corner cases do come up. So you need to talk to people, tell them how you feel, tell them what that means, tell them what you expect, what you're afraid of. Tell them why you care about them. What makes you happy about the people in your life. These things are really, really important. And they're what a lot of poly people will spend a lot of time talking about. So, I hope that you found that informative and interesting. And again, leave a comment here if you're asking for anything to be discussed, because I'd love to talk about it. Thanks. Bye.